They say the ocean remembers everything, but when it comes to the slave ships that sliced through the Atlantic between the 15th and 19th centuries, much of what the sea remembers, what it still whispers beneath the waves, is not in our history books. You know about chains, about shackles, but have you ever heard the silence of 300 souls packed into a ship's dark belly, unable to move or scream? Have you ever smelled the stench of human sorrow trapped for months below deck? This is not just history, it's a crime scene floating on salt water. What happened on those ships was not just transportation, it was annihilation of dignity, of humanity, and of memory. The argument was whether the slaves were goods under insurance law. Not a single person was convicted, not one, because in the eyes of the law, African bodies were commodities. Gori Island, Senegal, Bani, Nigeria, Ouida, Benin, the most infamous Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle in modern-day Ghana stand today as silent memorials. There, Africans waited weeks or months in damp, unlit chambers, chained to the floor, breathing the recycled air of despair. Many died before they even saw the ship. Men and women were captured through war, raids, or betrayal, often sold by rival kingdoms, merchants, or even local elites seeking firearms or European favor. But what happened after the sale was a slow-motion descent into hell. Below deck, Africans were packed side by side, shoulder to shoulder, lying flat on wooden planks with barely 18 inches between them and the beam above. But even that terrified the captains, not for moral reasons, but for insurance losses. That's why many enslaved were shackled at the ankles and wrists, often in pairs, to prevent mass suicide. Imagine not being able to sit up for months. Imagine lying next to a corpse for days because the crew only removed the dead during morning inspections. The men castrated for rebelling, the children smothered accidentally beneath piles of bodies. Nor did it show the speculomories, a device used to pry open the mouths of Africans who refused to eat, a cruel response to hunger strikes. The drawing showed the bodies laid like cargo, packed with such mathematical precision that the image became a tool of abolitionist propaganda. But the drawing was still a sanitized version of reality. Ships like the Henrietta Marie, the Jesus of the La Concorde, which was captured by Blackbeard and renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. But many scholars believe over 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone. Their bodies were thrown overboard, uncounted, unnamed, and unmourned. Arab traders transported enslaved Africans to places like Oman, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. Men were castrated to serve as eunuchs in royal courts. Women were often trafficked as concubines or house servants. His diaries, preserved today, offer a chilling glimpse into a world where human life was just another ledger entry. The journey across the Sahara and Red Sea mirrored the Middle Passage in its brutality, though the vessels and destinations differed. Manifests, inventory lists, captain's logs, they treated human suffering like data. That's how we know so much, and yet it's not what we're told in classrooms. And because facing this past means reckoning with systems that still profit from dehumanization. The Swahili coast, stretching from Somalia to Mozambique, was deeply entangled in this trade. Divers in the Caribbean speak of chains embedded in coral. Discovered in 2015, it was the first confirmed slave shipwreck ever recovered. Its rusted chains now lie in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, a history that turned human beings into currency of songs never sung again. And on quiet nights, some say you can hear voices beneath the waves singing songs in languages no longer spoken. The Atlantic Ocean became the largest mass grave in human history. These vessels were part of an enormous machinery funded by kings, merchants, banks, and empires. Replaceable, disposable. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities in human history, a statistic, a footnote. Yet somehow the most brutal details, the ones that show us who we truly are, remain buried beneath centuries of silence. During the dancing of the slaves, Africans were brought on deck in chains and forced to move or jump to the rhythm of a whip crack or drum. If they refused, they were flogged to the crew. It was a way to keep them healthy. But to the Africans, it was mockery, a forced masquerade, echoing their own rituals twisted into tools of Oppression, hidden in logbooks, merchant diaries, and passed down survivor tales, lies a secret history. In Dahomey present-day Benin, the economy revolved around the slave trade. Kingdoms like Oyo and Asante negotiated with European traders for weapons. Over time, war became a means not just for dominance but for profit. This created cycles of violence that left scars still felt across West Africa today. Women were placed in separate quarters, but this did not spare them. They were often subject to daily sexual violence by the ship's officers and crew. Olaudah Equiano, one of the most famous African abolitionists who wrote of his experiences aboard slave ships, spoke of the wretchedness beyond words of calculated torture, psychological warfare, and industrial-scale dehumanization. Let us return to 1781. The British slave ship Zong is deep in the Atlantic, having departed from the coast of present-day Ghana. The ship is overloaded for 42 Africans shackled in irons, barely able to breathe in the ship's lower deck, known ominously as the hold. Dysentery breaks out. The crew panics. Fresh water is running low. Captain Luke Collingwood makes a decision that defies comprehension. 132 enslaved men, women, and children are thrown overboard alive into the sea. The motive? Insurance fraud. The ship could not claim insurance money if slaves died of disease, but it could claim money for lost cargo if they were jettisoned to save the ship. When the ship docked in Jamaica, Collingwood filed for compensation. A legal case followed Gregson v. Gilbert. But here's the twist. The trial didn't debate whether it was murder. Now ask yourself, how does a human being become something disposable? To understand that, we must return further to the ports of West Africa. At the coast, captives were held in dungeons called slave castles, the door they passed through before boarding. The door of no return, a chilling name, and it was not metaphorical. On board the slave ships, the torture became mechanical. Each ship was built not for travel, but for containment. Diseases spread like wildfire: dysentery, smallpox, and the flux, as the sailors called it, bloody diarrhea brought on by infection, bad water, and psychological collapse. But the most haunting part wasn't the physical cruelty, it was the psychological torture to break their spirit. Captains used a twisted form of performance. Some resisted in silence, some through prayer. Others jumped overboard when they could, believing the ocean would carry their souls back home. In one recorded case, the ship Brooks, whose infamous blueprint was published by British abolitionists, carried over 600 enslaved Africans on a vessel legally designed for about 450. Why sanitized? Because it didn't show the screaming, the mothers separated from their infants, the pregnant women giving birth in chains. These were not just logistical cruelties. These were engineered acts of domination. The Portuguese called them navios negreiros. The British called them slavers. But to the Africans who survived them, they were floating tombs. By the 18th century, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans had been enslaved across the Atlantic. And yet many history textbooks mention this in passing. But it wasn't just death, it was transformation. Entire African societies were altered. In Asia, the story takes a parallel form. Although the transatlantic slave trade is often seen as African history, the Indian Ocean slave trade, which predates it, saw similar horrors. In Zanzibar's Stone Town, the market for slaves flourished well into the 19th century. One haunting account comes from Tipu Tip, a notorious Zanzibari slave trader who boasted of capturing thousands across Central Africa. But here's the final twist. Many of these ships, British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, kept meticulous records. Why? Because the truth is ugly. Because the faces of power in today's world are still shaped by the legacy of those empires. But the sea remembers. Fishermen off the coast of Ghana tell stories of nets that bring up skulls. What else is still buried beneath the ocean floor? Somewhere out there lies the wreck of the Sou. Paquete Africa, a Portuguese slave ship that sank near South Africa in 1794, killing over 200 enslaved Africans chained in its hold. But how many more remain unfound? How many stories have drowned unspoken? This is just one story, one layer of a history carefully erased, selectively remembered, and globally profitable. So the next time you hear the waves crash against the shore, remember they may be carrying echoes of names never written down. And if this story moved you, share it. because history is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. Like, subscribe, and comment below to join us here on History Off the Map, where we dig deeper into the stories that textbooks leave behind. What happened to the survivors after the ships docked? That is another story, and one you won't want to miss.